Bread is the food that generates the most guilt at breakfast for someone with diabetes or prediabetes, and at the same time the hardest to give up because it is central to the morning ritual of billions of people. But what science has discovered is that the problem is not bread itself, it is the type of bread, how it is prepared, and how it is consumed. The same bread, eaten in different ways, can have a glycemic index of 95 or 54. It can raise blood sugar by 70 points or by 20 points. Today, I will show you the 7 ways to eat bread that science has associated with better blood sugar control, and how to include each one in the breakfast of someone with diabetes. The problem with bread for someone with diabetes is not the gluten, not the wheat, not the carbohydrate itself. It is the speed of digestion. Industrial white bread has a glycemic index of 70 to 95. In contrast, a sourdough bread with 24 to 48 hours of long fermentation made with whole grain flour can have a glycemic index of 48 to 54, comparable to brown rice. That is not a marginal detail. It is a difference of 40 to 50 points in glycemic peak produced by the same nutrient, wheat carbohydrate, processed in different ways. Understanding this means understanding why the 7 ways on this list work. Way 1. Switch white bread for real whole grain bread. Real whole grain bread is one where the first ingredient on the label is whole grain flour, not wheat flour with added bran. Whole grain flour retains the germ and bran of the grain, which contain insoluble fiber, beta-glucans, phenolic acids, and phytates. Beta-glucans form a viscous gel in the small intestine that slows glucose absorption. A study in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition compared white bread with 4 types of whole grain bread in adults with type 2 diabetes and found glycemic peak reductions of 20 to 35%, depending on fiber content and grain granulometry. Breads with visible whole grains, oats, flaxseed, sesame, rye grains, have an even greater effect because the physical matrix of whole grains slows digestion more than fiber incorporated into flour. How to identify real whole grain bread? The first ingredient must be whole grain or whole wheat flour. Dark color is not sufficient. Many breads are darkened with caramel. Read the label. Patricia was 68 years old, a retired homemaker from Phoenix, who replaced her daily white bread with whole grain bread containing oats and flaxseed. With habitual fasting glucose of 138, post-breakfast glucose dropped from 189 to 152 milligrams per deciliter in 8 weeks. Way 2. Choose rye bread or whole rye grain bread. Rye deserves separate mention because it has specific mechanisms beyond those of conventional whole grain flour. Rye whole grain bread has documented glycemic index between 41 and 57. Rye contains arabinoxylans, soluble fibers specific to rye that form more viscous gels than wheat beta-glucans, more efficiently delaying glucose absorption. A clinical trial in the Journal of Nutrition showed that adults with metabolic syndrome who consumed whole rye bread for 12 weeks had significant reductions in fasting insulin and HOMA-IR compared to the whole wheat bread group, even with equivalent calories. Richard was 70 years old, a retired businessman from Cleveland, who introduced dark rye bread at breakfast. With HbA1c of 7.1 at baseline, it fell to 6.7 after 16 weeks. Way 3. Freeze and thaw bread before eating. When bread is frozen after baking, the gelatinized starch granules progressively reorganize into a less digestible crystalline form, resistant starch type 3. This process, called retrogradation, is more efficient at freezing temperatures than at normal refrigeration. A study in the European Journal of Clinical Nutrition tested white bread in 3 conditions: freshly purchased and consumed immediately, refrigerated 24 hours, and frozen 24 hours and thawed at room temperature. Result: frozen then thawed bread produced a glycemic peak 31% lower than fresh bread. Refrigerated bread produced only 12% reduction. Freezing is significantly more effective than simple refrigeration for increasing resistant starch in bread. Practical recipe. When buying bread, immediately freeze slices not to be consumed within 2 to 3 hours. When ready to use, Thaw at room temperature 20 to 30 minutes, or heat in toaster on low setting. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from right now. And if not yet subscribed, click the button and turn on the bell. Way 4. Add vinegar and olive oil to bread. Acetic acid in vinegar partially inhibits alpha amylase enzymes, slowing starch breakdown in the bread into glucose. A clinical trial in the European Journal of Clinical Nutrition showed that dipping white bread in a mixture of olive oil and vinegar before eating reduced postprandial glycemic peak by 28%. Olive oil stimulates production of GIP, gastric inhibitory peptide, which amplifies insulin secretion and delays gastric emptying. The olive oil plus vinegar combination acts through two distinct and complementary pathways on the glycemic peak of bread. How to implement? Prepare a bowl with extra virgin olive oil and 1 or 2 tablespoons of apple cider vinegar or balsamic vinegar to dip bread at breakfast. Way 5. Eat bread last at breakfast. A study in BMJ Open Diabetes Research and Care followed adults with type 2 diabetes in different breakfast consumption sequences. Result: eating eggs or yogurt before bread reduced the post-breakfast glucose peak by 29% compared to the sequence where bread was the first food consumed. The mechanism is the anticipated stimulation of GLP-1 by protein. Practical application: start with scrambled eggs, omelette, plain yogurt, or cottage cheese. Then the fruit. Finally, the bread. Margaret was 66 years old, a retired teacher from Phoenix, who reordered her breakfast. Before, bread with butter, then juice, then egg. After, scrambled egg, whole fruit, bread last. Post-breakfast glucose dropped from 182 to 141 milligrams per deciliter in 6 weeks without changing any food, only the order. Way 6. Choose bread with high proportion of seeds and nuts. Artisanal breads with flaxseed, chia, sesame, sunflower, pumpkin seeds, and nuts like walnuts or almonds have a very different glycemic profile. Seed protein delays gastric emptying. Fat activates PPAR alpha receptors. Seed fiber adds viscosity in the small intestine. A study in diabetes care showed that adults with prediabetes who added 30 grams of nuts and seeds to their bread breakfast had a 38% lower glycemic peak. Flaxseed deserves special mention. In addition to soluble fiber and omega-3 fat, flaxseed contains lignans with documented effects on insulin sensitivity improvement through PPAR gamma receptor activation, the same receptor targeted by thiazolidinedione anti-diabetic medications. Frank was 67 years old, a retired engineer from Cleveland, who started eating whole grain bread with peanut butter and ground flaxseed. HbA1c dropped from 6.9 to 6.5% in 14 weeks. Way 7. Choose or make sourdough bread with long natural fermentation. Sourdough bread has a documented glycemic index between 48 and 57, compared to conventional white bread GI 70 to 95. The lactic and acetic acids produced by sourdough bacteria during fermentation modify the starch structure. These acids also directly inhibit alpha amylase and alpha glucosidase enzymes in the small intestine. Prolonged fermentation partially degrades gluten and phytates, releasing minerals like zinc and magnesium that are cofactors for insulin metabolism enzymes. The lactic acid bacteria in sourdough produce exapolysaccharides during fermentation that act as prebiotics in the intestine, selecting bacterial strains that produce propionate and butyrate, the short-chain fatty acids that improve insulin sensitivity. A clinical trial published in Nutrients in 2020 directly compared conventional white bread, conventional whole grain bread, white wheat sourdough, and whole wheat sourdough in healthy adults and adults with prediabetes. Whole wheat sourdough had the lowest glycemic response of all types, even lower than conventional non-sourdough whole grain, with a 41% reduction in glycemic peak compared to conventional white bread. To identify real sourdough, the label must list natural fermentation starter or sourdough starter and must not contain commercial biological yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae. The minimum fermentation time documented in studies for glycemic effect is 12 hours. Patricia Grandmother was 71 years old, a retired schoolteacher from Atlanta with type 2 diabetes and HbA1c of 7.6. After 20 weeks eating homemade whole grain sourdough replacing her daily white bread, HbA1c dropped to 7.0 and post-breakfast glucose averaged 148 milligrams per deciliter versus the original 194. Summary of the 7 ways. Way 1. Real whole grain bread. Fiber plus beta-glucans plus phytates. Reduction 20 to 35%. Way 2. Whole rye bread. Slower hydrolysis, rye starch plus arabinoxylans, GI 41 to 57. Way 3. Frozen and thawed bread, resistant starch type 3, reduction 31% of glycemic peak. Way 4. Vinegar and olive oil, alpha amylase inhibition plus delayed gastric emptying plus GIP, reduction 28%. Way 5. Bread last in meal. Anticipated GLP-1 and insulin stimulation, reduction 29%. Way 6. With seeds and nuts, protein plus fat plus fiber additive, reduction 35 to 38% of effective GI. Way 7. Long fermentation sourdough, organic acids plus modified starch plus prebiotics, GI 48 to 57, reduction 41%. Practical plan for breakfast with diabetes. The best breakfast with bread for someone with diabetes combines several of these ways simultaneously. Whole grain sourdough or rye bread, frozen and thawed, eaten last at breakfast after eggs and fruit, with extra virgin olive oil to dip. This combination can reduce the breakfast glycemic peak by 50 to 60% compared to fresh white bread eaten first. Golden rule: never eat fresh hot white bread alone first at breakfast. Important: all dietary changes for people with diabetes should be monitored with a glucometer and discussed with a doctor or nutritionist. Do not stop medications without medical guidance. A review study in Diabetes Care 2022, analyzing 31 interventions with different types and ways of eating bread in adults with diabetes, concluded that replacing conventional white bread with whole grain sourdough combined with eating order strategies and addition of nuts and seeds produced the greatest reductions in HbA1c and postprandial glucose among all isolated dietary interventions studied for breakfast, revealing experiment with a glucometer. Day 1. 2 slices of fresh white bread, butter and juice, bread first. Day 2. Same 2 slices but frozen and thawed with scrambled egg before, whole fruit in the middle, and bread with olive oil last. Measure glucose before and 1 and 2 hours after on both days. The difference of 40 to 60 points in the 1-hour peak is the most convincing proof. Note on commercial versus homemade sourdough. The sourdough that works for glycemic control is one that underwent slow fermentation of at least 12 hours. When buying sourdough, ingredients should be only flour, water, salt, and starter, without added biological yeast. Homemade sourdough is always the most controlled option. My friend, bread does not need to be eliminated from the breakfast of someone with diabetes. It needs to be chosen wisely and consumed strategically. With the 7 ways on this list, you can maintain the bread ritual at breakfast with a completely different glycemic profile. Start this week. Freeze the bread you already have, eat the egg first, and add a drizzle of olive oil with a little vinegar for dipping. Then measure glucose 1 hour later and compare with what it used to be. The numbers will surprise you. God bless you and give you much health. Until next time. About the synergy of the ways. Cumulative effect. Each way on this list has an independent documented effect, but when combined, the effect can be synergic. Resistant starch from freezing reduces starch available for digestion. Vinegar inhibits the enzymes that initiate that digestion. Protein from egg eaten before stimulates GLP-1 before the starch arrives. Seeds add protein and fat that slow gastric emptying. Sourdough already arrives with modified starch structure. Applying 4 or 5 of these techniques simultaneously can reduce the breakfast glycemic peak by 50 to 60% compared to the worst scenario. The glycemic load, accounting for both GI and serving size, is the most relevant indicator. 2 slices of frozen thawed whole grain sourdough with egg before, olive oil and vinegar, consumed last at breakfast, have a glycemic load of approximately 10 to 12, which is considered low. The same volume of fresh white bread consumed first has a glycemic load of 20 to 25. Research consistently shows that food preparation and consumption method is one of the most powerful and least used tools in diabetes dietary management. Bread, correctly chosen and consumed, is not your enemy. It is part of a breakfast that can be delicious and metabolically smart at the same time. The glucometer will be your ally to verify progress. Measure before breakfast and 1 and 2 hours after, and observe how the numbers change when you apply these strategies. Science supports it. Your glucometer will confirm it. The combination of evidence is clear. Sourdough fermentation alone reduces GI by 40%. Adding whole grain multiplies the fiber and arabinoxalan effects. Freezing adds 31% resistant starch benefit. Eating last adds 29% GLP-1 stimulation effect. Seeds add 38% through protein, fat, and viscous fiber. None of these is a magic bullet alone. Together, they produce a breakfast experience that is genuinely compatible with good blood sugar management, sustainable over the long term, and enjoyable enough to maintain indefinitely. Additional notes on homemade versus commercial sourdough. Making sourdough at home is surprisingly simple. 50 grams of whole grain flour, 50 grams of water, left in an open jar for 5 to 7 days with daily feeding of the same proportions until it is active and bubbly. Then mix with flour, water, and salt. Ferment 12 to 24 hours and bake. Homemade sourdough guarantees the minimum 12-hour fermentation documented in studies for glycemic effect. Why this matters beyond blood sugar. People with diabetes who feel deprived of foods they love have worse dietary adherence, higher treatment abandonment rates, and worse health-related quality of life. The ability to safely include bread, a culturally central food in American life, from toast to sandwiches to dinner rolls, is not just a question of glycemic control. It is a question of food dignity, pleasure in eating, long-term sustainability of the dietary plan. The 7 ways on this list are the bridge between science and real life. With the correct knowledge, bread does not have to be your enemy. It can be part of a breakfast that is simultaneously delicious, culturally meaningful, and metabolically smart. Start today applying the simplest way for you. Any one of the 7 you apply already produces a measurable difference. 2 or 3 together produce real transformation. Your glucometer will tell you if you are on the right track. Trust the numbers, not the fear. The research consistently shows that food preparation and consumption method is one of the most powerful yet underused tools in diabetes dietary management. For a food as widely consumed and culturally significant as bread, understanding how to transform its glycemic impact through preparation and consumption strategies gives people with diabetes a practical, sustainable, and enjoyable approach that increases dietary adherence and quality of life. Complete breakfast strategy for diabetics. 4-week plan. Week 1. Implement only the order change. Eat egg first, then fruit, bread last. Week 2. Add bread freezing. Freeze all slices and thaw before using. Week 3. Add the olive oil and vinegar bowl for dipping. Week 4. Try to buy or make whole grain sourdough. In 4 weeks, most people with well-controlled type 2 diabetes will see a 30 to 50% reduction in their breakfast glycemic peak. Each week adds a new habit and amplifies the effect of the previous ones. Consistency is more important than perfection. If one day you cannot apply all the strategies, apply what you can. The system is greater than the sum of its parts, but each part is valuable on its own. The goal is not perfection, but sustainable progress toward better glycemic control without sacrificing pleasure at the table. A glucometer reading 1 hour after breakfast is the most direct feedback you can get about whether these strategies are working for you. Use it. The research supports these strategies. The numbers will confirm them. Bread can be part of your life with diabetes, with knowledge, strategy, and the glucometer as your ally to measure real progress. About resistant starch and the gut microbiome. The resistant starch in frozen bread and sourdough bread does more than just reduce the glycemic peak. When it reaches the large intestine, it selectively nourishes beneficial bacteria of the Bifidobacterium and Lactobacillus genera. These bacteria produce butyrate and propionate, short-chain fatty acids that improve insulin sensitivity in liver and muscle cells, reduce hepatic gluconeogenesis, and strengthen the intestinal mucosal barrier. This means these ways of consuming bread not only reduce the immediate glycemic peak, but, consumed regularly, contribute to microbiome changes that can improve insulin sensitivity over the long term. The glycemic index is the first step. The microbiome effect is the second layer of benefit. The sourdough plus freezing combination acts on both levels simultaneously. This is the level of complexity that modern metabolism science reveals. The same molecules, organic acids, resistant starch, arabinoxylans, have immediate effects on glycemia and long-term effects on the microbiome and insulin sensitivity. For someone with diabetes or prediabetes, this knowledge transforms breakfast from a moment of guilt into a metabolically intelligent opportunity every morning. The science is clear, the choices are in your hands. Start with what is easiest, the order change, and build from there. Every step in the right direction matters. Executive summary for acting today. The best breakfast with bread for someone with diabetes. Whole grain frozen and thawed sourdough with egg first, whole fruit in the middle, bread with olive oil and vinegar last. This combination can reduce the breakfast glycemic peak by 50 to 60%. You do not need everything at once. Start with the order change today. Add freezing this week. The sourdough can come later. Every small change counts. With the correct knowledge, bread can remain part of your life with diabetes, with pleasure, and with control. God bless you and give you much health. Until next time. A final motivating note. The glucometer does not lie. Measure your glucose 1 hour after today's breakfast. Then apply these 7 strategies tomorrow and measure again. The difference of 30 to 60 points in the 1-hour peak is the most persuasive evidence that preparation method matters as much as the food itself. Science supports it. Your glucometer will confirm it. Bread with knowledge and strategy can stay on your table. 7 ways. 1 transformed breakfast. A life with diabetes that is more manageable and more enjoyable. Start today. The research is solid, the strategies are practical, and the results are verifiable with your own glucometer every morning. May God bless you with good health. Do not wait any longer. Tomorrow's breakfast can be completely different from today's. With the same bread, prepared intelligently, the difference on the glucometer will demonstrate it.